This page is primarily about the classic, or medieval, Western European form of feudalism. For feudalism as practiced in other societies, as well as that of the Europeans, see examples of feudalism. Feudalism was a combination of legal and military customs in medieval Europe that flourished between the 9th and 15th centuries. Broadly defined, it was a way of structuring society around relationships derived from the holding of land in exchange for service or labor, although derived from the Latin word feudum or feudum, then in use. The term feudalism and the system it describes were not conceived of as a formal political system by the people living in the Middle Ages. In its classic definition, by François-Louis Ganshoff, feudalism describes a set of reciprocal legal and military obligations among the warrior nobility, revolving around the three key concepts of lords, vassals and fiefs. A broader definition of feudalism, as described by Marc Bloch, includes not only the obligations of the warrior nobility but those of all three estates of the realm: the nobility, the clergy, and the peasantry bound by manorialism. This is sometimes referred to as a feudal society. Since the publication of Elizabeth A. R. Brown's The Tyranny of a Construct, and Susan Reynolds's Fiefs and Vassals, there has been ongoing inconclusive discussion among medieval historians as to whether feudalism is a useful construct for understanding medieval society. Definition: there is no commonly accepted modern definition of feudalism, at least among scholars. The adjective feudal was coined in the 17th century, and the noun feudalism, often used in a political and propaganda context, was not coined until the 19th century, from the French féodalité, itself an 18th century creation. In a classic definition by François-Louis Ganshoff, feudalism describes a set of reciprocal legal and military obligations among the warrior nobility, revolving around the three key concepts of lords, vassals and fiefs, though Ganshoff himself noted that his treatment related only to the narrow, technical, legal sense of the word. A broader definition, as described in Marc Bloch's Feudal Society, includes not only the obligations of the warrior nobility but those of all three estates of the realm: the nobility, the clergy, and those living by their labor, most directly the peasantry bound by manorialism. This order is often referred to as feudal society, echoing Bloch's usage. Since the publication of Elizabeth A. R. Brown's The Tyranny of a Construct, and Susan Reynolds's Fiefs and Vassals, there has been ongoing inconclusive discussion among medieval historians as to whether feudalism is a useful construct for understanding medieval society. Outside a European context, the concept of feudalism is often used only by analogy, most often in discussions of feudal Japan under the shoguns and sometimes medieval and Gondrine Ethiopia. However, some have taken the feudalism analogy further, seeing feudalism in places as diverse as ancient Egypt, the Parthian Empire, the Indian subcontinent and the antebellum and Jim Crow American South. The term feudalism has also been applied, often inappropriately or pejoratively, to non-Western societies where institutions and attitudes similar to those of medieval Europe are perceived to prevail. Some historians and political theorists believe that the term feudalism has been deprived of specific meaning by the many ways it has been used, leading them to reject it as a useful concept for understanding society. Etymology. The term «féodal» was used in 17th-century French legal treatises and translated into English legal treatises as an adjective, such as «feudal government». In the 18th century, Adam Smith, seeking to describe economic systems, effectively coined the forms «feudal government» and «feudal system» in his book Wealth of Nations. In the 19th century the adjective «feudal» evolved into a noun, feudalism. The term feudalism is recent, first appearing in French in 1823, Italian in 1827, English in 1839, and in German in the second half of the 19th century. The term feudal or feudal is derived from the medieval Latin word feudum. The etymology of feudum is complex with multiple theories, some suggesting a Germanic origin and others suggesting an Arabic origin. Initially in medieval Latin European documents, a land grant in exchange for service was called a beneficium. Later, the term feudum or feudum began to replace beneficium in the documents. The first attested instance of this is from 984, although more primitive forms were seen up to 100 years earlier. The origin of the feudum and why it replaced beneficium has not been well established, but there are multiple theories, described below. The most widely held theory is put forth by Mark Bloch. Bloch said it is related to the Frankish term *fehuode, in which *fehu means cattle, and ode means goods, implying a movable object of value. Bloch explains that by the beginning of the 10th century it was common to value land in monetary terms but to pay for it movable objects of equivalent value, such as arms, clothing, horses or food. This was known as feos, a term that took on the general meaning of paying for something in lieu of money. This meaning was then applied to land itself, in which land was used to pay for fealty, such as to a vassal. Thus the old word feos meaning movable property changed little by little to feus meaning the exact opposite, landed property. This Germanic origin theory was also shared by William Stubbs in the 19th century. Another theory was put forward by Archibald R. Lewis. Lewis said the origin of fief is not feudum, but rather fodrum, the earliest attested use being in Astronomus's Vita Ludovicia. In that text is a passage about Louis the Pious that says "Annona militaris quaes vulgo foderum vocant," which can be translated as, Louis forbade that military provender be furnished. Another theory by Alaruddin Samerai suggests an Arabic origin, from fuyu. Samerai's theory is that early forms of fief include feo, few, feus, feum and others. The plurality of forms strongly suggesting origins from a loan word. Indeed, the first use of these terms is in Languedoc, one of the least Germanic areas of Europe and bordering Muslim Spain. Further, the earliest use of feum can be dated to 899, the same year a Muslim base at Fraxinetum in Provence was established. It is possible, Samerai says, that French scribes, writing in Latin, attempted to transliterate the Arabic word fuyu, which was being used by the Muslim invaders and occupiers at the time, resulting in a plurality of forms, feo, few, feus, feum and others, from which eventually feudum derived. Samerai, however, also advises to handle this theory with care, as medieval and early modern Muslim scribes often used etymologically fanciful roots, in order to claim the most outlandish things to be of Arabian or Muslim origin. History. Feudalism, in its various forms, usually emerged as a result of the decentralization of an empire, especially in the Carolingian empires, which both lacked the bureaucratic infrastructure necessary to support cavalry without the ability to allocate land to these mounted troops. Mounted soldiers began to secure a system of hereditary rule over their allocated land, and their power over the territory came to encompass the social, political, judicial, and economic spheres. These acquired powers significantly diminished unitary power in these empires. Only when the infrastructure existed to maintain unitary power, as with the European monarchies, did feudalism begin to yield to this new power structure and eventually disappear. Classic feudalism. See also feudalism in England. Feudalism in the Holy Roman Empire and examples of feudalism. The classic François-Louis Gansoff version of feudalism describes a set of reciprocal, legal and military obligations among the warrior nobility, revolving around the three key concepts of lords, vassals and fiefs. A lord was in broad terms a noble who held land, a vassal was a person who was granted possession of the land by the lord, and the land was known as a fief. In exchange for the use of the fief and the protection of the lord, the vassal would provide some sort of service to the lord. There were many varieties of feudal land tenure, consisting of military and non-military service. The obligations and corresponding rights between lord and vassal concerning the fief form the basis of the feudal relationship. Vassalage. Before a lord could grant land to someone, he had to make that person a vassal. This was done at a formal and symbolic ceremony called a commendation ceremony, which was composed of the two-part act of homage and oath of fealty. During homage, the lord and vassal entered into a contract in which the vassal promised to fight for the lord at his command, whilst the lord agreed to protect the vassal from external forces. Fealty comes from the Latin fidelitas and denotes the fidelity owed by a vassal to his feudal lord. Fealty also refers to an oath that more explicitly reinforces the commitments of the vassal made during homage. Such an oath follows homage. Once the commendation ceremony was complete, the lord and vassal were in a feudal relationship with agreed obligations to one another. The vassal's principal obligation to the lord was to aid, or military service, using whatever equipment the vassal could obtain by virtue of the revenues from the fief. The vassal was responsible to answer calls to military service on behalf of the lord. This security of military help was the primary reason the lord entered into the feudal relationship. In addition, the vassal could have other obligations to his lord, such as attendance at his court, whether manorial, baronial, both termed court baron, or at the king's court. It could also involve the vassal providing counsel, so that if the lord faced a major decision he would summon all his vassals and hold a council. At the level of the manor, this might be a fairly mundane matter of agricultural policy, but also included sentencing by the lord for criminal offences, including capital punishment in some cases. Concerning the king's feudal court, such deliberation could include the question of declaring war. These are examples. Depending on the period of time and location in Europe, feudal customs and practices varied. See examples of feudalism. The feudal revolution in France. In its origin, the feudal grant of land had been seen in terms of a personal bond between lord and vassal, but with time and the transformation of fiefs into hereditary holdings, the nature of the system came to be seen as a form of politics of land. The 11th century in France saw what has been called by historians a feudal revolution, or mutation, and a fragmentation of powers that was unlike the development of feudalism in England or Italy or Germany in the same period or later. Counties and duchies began to break down into smaller holdings as castellans and lesser seigneurs took control of local lands, and lesser lords usurped, privatized a wide range of prerogatives and rights of the state, most importantly the highly profitable rights of justice, but also travel dues, market dues, fees for using woodlands, obligations to use the lord's mill, etc. Power in this period became more personal. This fragmentation of powers was not, however, systematic throughout France, and in certain counties, counts were able to maintain control of their lands into the 12th century or later. Thus, in some regions, the vassal, feudal system was an effective tool for ducal and comital control, linking vassals to their lords, but in other regions, the system led to significant confusion. All the more so as vassals could frequently pledge themselves to two or more lords. In response to this, the idea of a liege lord was developed in the 12th century. End of European feudalism. Feudalism itself decayed and effectively disappeared in most of Western Europe by about 1500. It lingered on in parts of Central and Eastern Europe as late as the 1850s. Russia finally abolished serfdom in 1861. However, even when the original feudal relationships had disappeared, there were many institutional remnants of feudalism left in place. Historian Georges Lefebvre explains how at an early stage of the French Revolution, on just one night of the 4th of August 1789, France abolished the long-lasting remnants of the feudal order. It announced the National Assembly abolishes the feudal system entirely, Lefebvre explains. Without debate, the Assembly enthusiastically adopted equality of taxation and redemption of all manorial rights except for those involving personal servitude, which were to be abolished without indemnification. Other proposals followed with the same success: the equality of legal punishment, admission of all to public office, abolition of venality in office, conversion of the tithe into payments subject to redemption, freedom of worship, prohibition of plural holding of benefices. Privileges of provinces and towns were offered as a last sacrifice. Originally the peasants were supposed to pay for the release of seigneurial dues. These dues affected more than a fourth of the farmland in France, and provided most of the income of the large landowners. The majority refused to pay, and in 1793 the obligation was cancelled. Thus the peasants got their land free, and also no longer paid the tithe to the church. Feudal Society. The phrase «feudal society», as defined by Mark Bloch, offers a wider definition than Ganshoff's and includes within the feudal structure not only the warrior aristocracy bound by vassalage, but also the peasantry bound by manorialism, and the estates of the church. Thus the feudal order embraces society from top to bottom. Though the powerful and well-differentiated social group of the urban classes came to occupy a distinct position to some extent outside the classical feudal hierarchy,